Good, thank you. Thank you all very much. Delighted to be here. I walked around the town yesterday in that rain. I found the town quite charming, even in the rain. I have a number of thank yous that I have to express. First, to the Fulbright Association, the Council for the International Exchange of Scholars, and the U.S.-India Educational Foundation, which funded my prior 5-month trip to India. I'm going to be quoting a few of the people that I interviewed, and so I'm grateful for the support that I got there. I'm thankful to the Panacea Trust and the Center for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements for bringing me out here to talk with you today, and to Sean, who helped make all the details work, and to Simon, who invited me and then leapt through all kinds of hoops to make sure it would all work out. So I'm really grateful for that. And most of all, I am thankful to those of you who are here with us today in the audience. Thank you for coming. I'm glad the weather was good to you. Nowadays, when people ask me to talk about artificial intelligence, I try to find unusual ways to link that to my study of India. So today is a totally novel experiment in doing that. I just thought, since there were horses all around, that maybe I could have a whole talk that would just be sort of linked together by horses. And so we'll see how that goes, and hopefully it'll be at least a moderate pleasure for everyone here. Apocalyptic visions dominate popular and even scientific visions of digital technology in Western, particularly American culture. Thanks to a variety, of champions, I'll discuss a traditional vanguard of 4. This apocalyptic AI movement encourages people to see a glorious new world on the digital horizon. For good or ill, apocalyptic AI visionaries hope that their perspective will dominate global progress. In India, however, a number of obstacles stand in the way of such a trajectory. Only through sacrifice can the world be rendered anew according to Indian traditions, and thus the transhumanist promises of apocalyptic AI may ride across the landscape, but no transformation will be possible without changes to the Western agenda. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with a bunch of the terms I just used, I promise I'm going to define them as I move my way forward. But first, I have to apologize for 3 naive simplifications, oversimplifications. I'm going to occasionally talk about Judeo-Christian apocalyptic tradition, as though there were only one such thing, right? And that means I'm unifying texts like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, and Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and of course the book of Revelation. I'm lumping it all kind of together into one category. And that's because there are unifying themes that can be perceived even across individual distinctions. So I apologize for that. The second is I'm going to talk every once in a while about Euro-American culture, as though there were just one such thing. Whatever that thing might be, and depending on where you are, it might seem more or less likely to exist. I'm going to pretend like it does for the next 30, 40 minutes so that I can use words like the West and Western and Euro-American, and we're all going to pretend like we know what that means. Finally, I'm going to make a pretense toward objectivity. I am not judging the truth value or even necessarily the moral value of apocalyptic AI claims. I'm tracing cultural configurations of those claims and the dynamics of transmission, and that's more or less all. So, this is the most words that any of the slides are going to have. I apologize for having so many of them. I thought it was sort of relevant to at least give you a sense of what I do. I study religion, science, and technology. I do that in cross-cultural contexts, and a lot of my research has been about digital technology and religion. And so in a book I wrote a few years ago, I talked about how popular science books written by scientists establish a kind of religious perspective on robotics and artificial intelligence. And the first half of this talk is going to kind of articulate what that vision might have been. And that perspective, as they articulate it in those books, is now held by a number of people and is kind of a growing movement of people that I'm going to call transhumanists. Transhumanists are people who believe that we can use science and technology to fulfill more or less the traditional goals of religion, right? That we can transcend our limitations, that we can cure all diseases, maybe produce perfect happiness, maybe become immortal, maybe replace our bodies with wonderful robot bodies that will never get hurt or break or die or do any of those terrible things that our mortal bodies have a tendency of doing. In some sense, we are all transhumanists, because if your eyes go bad, you will wear glasses. So you are already committed to the idea that you can use technology to overcome your limitations. But there are some people for whom that desire to overcome their limitations is much more radical than for others. There seems to be a pretty huge leap between wearing glasses and wanting to upload your mind into a robot and live forever, right? So we're going to, those are the transhumanists that we're going to be talking about, and this is a movement that's gaining in popularity. All right. So to set it all up, I have to talk about what I mean by apocalypticism. If I'm going to talk about Judeo-Christian apocalypticism, we have to have something. So this is a social movement to talk about apocalypticism, as opposed to an apocalyptic text. And the social movement can be characterized in a quick little typology with these 4 characteristics, which I'm going to go through one at a time. Right? First, an apocalyptic viewpoint is dualistic. It perceives the world as a struggle between good and evil. They're the forces of good and they're fighting the forces of evil, and that's the cosmic battle that kind of pervades all of history and all of human activity. And it can be seen all around us, assuming you are of an apocalyptic bent, right? You will be able to perceive that battle. Unfortunately, you will also be alienated because it will seem to be the case that the bad guys are always winning. Right? If we look in the news, we hear terrible news about killer robots and whether or not we should be trying to boycott those companies, right? So the idea here is that bad things happen to all of us, and whether it's because we're psychologically predisposed to do so or for some other reason, because bad things happen, is we're going to see the bad and we're going to emphasize it, and we're going to experience alienation in the world. And the ultimate bad thing that's going to happen is that we're all going to die, and since we can't overcome that experience, alienation is just part of the apocalyptic worldview, which is nevertheless an optimistic one. Despite the alienation, despite the fact that the bad guys seem to be winning all the time, apocalyptics are optimistic, apocalyptic mindsets, because there's the anticipation that a transcendent new world is on its way, as inaugurated by God or the gods or some sort of transcendent natural force. Whatever is at stake will bring about a transcendent new world. I hope you can see the pictures, by the way. So fundamentally, there is optimism, but unfortunately for us, if a transcendent new perfect world, where that dualism is erased, where it's no longer good against evil because the only thing that remains is kind of the good, we don't deserve to be there. Not one of us, right? Because we're all imperfect creations. And so, in the apocalyptic mindset, we anticipate transcendent new bodies to occupy the transcendent new world, that we will be reconfigured. You can see perfect examples of this. For example, those of you who are familiar with Paul's letters, chapter 15 of the first letter to Corinthians, Paul talks about how we will not all die, but we will be changed in an instant, and we will take on the glory of the stars. And so for him, this idea that we'll gain this, for Paul, he's concerned with sin, we'd gain a sinless new body to occupy and to live forever. So that's what I mean when I talk about apocalypticism in general, when I'm thinking about Judeo-Christian apocalyptic visions. Within these visions, there's a radical transformation of this world that's dependent on the social context of the visionaries themselves. And the most kind of compelling image of the apocalypse has been the 4 horsemen of the book of Revelation: death, war, famine, and conquest. Sometimes conquest gets written as pestilence, but most of the time conquest, who are these harbingers of a new world, right? Of judgment, but followed by this wonderful new world. And because there are 4 horsemen in the book of Revelation, I'm going to talk about 4 horsemen in what we're now going to define as apocalyptic AI. We're going to skip 2,000 years of history, and we're going to move from these ancient texts to contemporary authors who actually fit within that same 4-fold model, only we're going to swap out God and we're going to put robots in, right? And otherwise, the model is actually shockingly similar. I'm not going to talk about science fiction, even though a lot of these ideas are prevalent in science fiction, even though these 4 people whose names are up here are deeply influenced by science fiction, and even though science fiction kind of evangelism is widespread in the US and elsewhere. For now, what I want to talk about is, or rather I want to leave science fiction in the background and talk about the technological leaders who are in the foreground, because they're the ones that create this shiny scientific gloss that makes these claims believable to a host of people, right? They've elevated science fiction from the fringe to the mainstream by supporting those very same ideas, and essentially are wreaking havoc on tradition through their kind of digital reconfiguration of it to create the plausibility of this thing called apocalyptic AI, which will be clear as we work through these guys. The first of the four, and to my mind the most important, because he's really the preeminent thinker in that area, is Hans Moravec, who is a seminal roboticist. If any of you have seen a Roomba vacuum cleaner navigate its way through a room, then you are experiencing the outcome of his research. He spent decades trying to figure out how to make robots move through space, and an absolutely critical figure. But he's also the critical figure in this apocalyptic artificial intelligence movement, because it was he who really, first in an essay in the 1970s, subsequently in a book, Mind Children, in the 1980s, and then third in this book, Robot, which he published in the 1990s, articulated a vision where computers were getting faster every other year or so, right? They were just about doubling every 18 to 24 months. And robot vision, which was a field that he was deeply interested in, was getting better at approximately the same speed. And so he said, as long as the technologies are going to keep basically doubling every now and then ultimately the computers are going to get really, really, really fast. And he said, that's kind of more or less the same as them being really, really, really smart. Now, that's not necessarily true, but it might be true. We can't really judge that question right at the moment. So he then said, since the machines are going to get really, really, really smart, we're going to have this amazing world where the machines are all going to be way smarter than we are. They're going to make us look dumb in short order. And because of that, he said, we're going to need to evolve ourselves. And so he articulated this technological exponential curve of progress. And he said, don't worry, it's okay, because when the machines take over the world, right, and they convert the entire cosmos into a machine universe, you're going to get to join, because we'll be able to slice up your brain, and we'll be able to copy all the content of your sliced up brain into a computer brain. Now, the wonderful part about that actually is that he wanted to slice up your brain. It doesn't feel like that, but that would prevent arguments. Because if we have to slice up your brain, there's only one of you at the end of the road. The other people we're going to talk about later, particularly when we get to Ray Kurzweil, he just wants to scan your brain. At which point, who owns the car becomes a very relevant question, right? But for the time being, Moravec figures we're going to slice you up. And we're going to transfer your consciousness into a machine, and you can either inhabit a robot body that can do all kinds of wonderful things, or you could inhabit a virtual world. So he's absolutely a critical figure in this. Now, Kevin Warwick agrees with Moravec that the machines are going to get really, really, really smart. He's also a roboticist, but he's interested in cyborg interfaces. Here is a picture of him when he had a computer chip implanted in his arm so he could go like this, and then the robot arm would do the same thing. And he's very interested in this same question of what happens as the machines get really, really, really intelligent, but he's leery that we want to do things like slice up our brains and copy our minds into robots. So he figures we need to be cyborgs in order to be competitive. Not just robot arms, but robot prostheses to our brains to give us more memory, faster computation, and so forth, so that we can actually interact in a world of super hyper-intelligent machines. Philip Rosedale is the only person I'm talking about who has not published a popular science book. He's just founded a couple of companies. One of which, I don't know if anybody has seen Second Life, but he was the founder of Second Life, which is an online virtual reality platform where you create a little avatar and you walk around the environment. You meet people, you talk to people, you do things. And he himself has expressed the belief that perhaps within Second Life or a similar kind of platform, the computation will become so immense that it will wake up all by itself. Right? So he's reflecting this idea that the computers are going to get so fast that they're going to get smart. He's also stated that the big problem we have is that we die and that we need to solve death. So he's in this same picture and an innovator in the technologies that people like Moravec are interested in. Finally, we have the most popular of these people, Ray Kurzweil, who's justly well known for his inventions, the first reading devices for the blind and so forth, and who published The Singularity is Near in 2005, The Age of Spiritual Machines in 1999. These are books that mostly rehash what Moravec had already said. He makes them a little more readable, he adds some more examples, and he extrapolates. But it's the same basic argument, but he's become enormously popular. I put this particular book up here just because I like the subtitle, which if you can't read it, it says, "Live long enough to live forever." Because that is his premise, and he will sell you vitamins to help out in that process, which I shouldn't tease. He's a nice man. I've met him. I liked him. But he is an enormously popular figure in the movement that I'm calling apocalyptic AI, which I now want to finally, after like 25 minutes, define. It is the same fourfold typology. You see a dualistic universe where biology and computers are put in opposition to one another, computation versus biology, because you learn slowly, you forget things, and ultimately you're going to die. Moravec describes death. He says the worst thing about death is the, quote, wanton loss of information, unquote. That's a really odd, to me, an odd way to think about death. But nevertheless, there it is. There's this dualistic worldview in which we are alienated, right? The computers are going to be smarter than we are. Silicon will always process more rapidly than our carbon-based life forms. So because we learn slowly, we can't out-compute a computer, and we are ultimately going to die. We live in kind of this alienated world. But don't worry, that transcendent new world is on its way. The world where computers just sweep through everything, and they turn everything into computers. Whole planets become computers as they move throughout the cosmos. And we will, of course, join that in our glorious new robot bodies, or virtual software bodies. Right, one way or the other. Now this is a fascinating intersection of religion, science, and technology for me. It reveals the total inadequacy of when people, those conflict and harmony kind of narratives about religion and science, when people say things like, since the time of Galileo, religion and science have been at war. Now they're not even right about Galileo. That's not actually true about Galileo. But putting that issue aside, this particular example shows that sometimes we need to have much more nuanced ways of talking, right? Because if you have a religion of digital computers, then we have some kind of harmony, maybe in little scare quotes, some kind of harmony between religion and science. But that might be in scare quotes conflict with some other person's perspective from a traditional religious angle. Right? So what the pop science authors are doing is religious work. They're articulating a new universe of Moravec's meaningful computation, and in doing so give us something kind of interesting. But artificial intelligence cannot transform the cosmos until it has transformed Earth. The religious visions of apocalyptic AI must overcome their local competition, and that means cultural transmission matters. Right? It offers a chance for further reconfiguration of these apocalyptic claims. In India, as in Revelation, horses still inaugurate new kingdoms and carry conquest in their stride across the landscape. But in the end, the horse itself must be sacrificed, asphyxiated as part of the ritual's culmination. The Asvamedha sacrifice, as described in a host of ancient texts. It happens in the ancient epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and it's described in the Vedas and in others, is a sacrifice of a horse conducted by a king. It's been centuries since this has been attempted. The last known attempt was in the early 18th century. And in it, it's really important to keep in mind that the Hindu king was himself aligned with cosmic order. As we see in, say, the Rajasuya consecration ritual, the king himself is perceived as permeating the cosmos through moments of that ritual. And so the transformation of kingship that I'm going to describe in the Asvamedha sacrifice through coronation or through the expanded rulership involves necessary transformations of the cosmos. Because what happens in the Asvamedha sacrifice is a king releases a horse, and the horse wanders the landscape. But behind the horse is a great big army. And anywhere that horse goes, the king has now claimed as his land. right? During this time, the horse is going to wander for a whole year, and the king is supposed to be on like a learning holiday. He's going to study, he's going to pray, he's going to remain celibate, and the horse will be doing all the work for him. Now, if you're a local king and the horse wanders through your land, you have two choices. You can either fight the king's army. You can say, I don't recognize his sovereignty, and then you have to fight, or you can recognize the king's sovereignty, at which point you now, will pay taxes and so forth to the new king. Right? So you have a choice if you're there. But the horse itself is going to wander around, and at the end of the year, you're going to kind of gently lead it back, and then you're going to perform this ritual. Now, as it is described in the Apastama Sutra, the sacrifice itself involves hundreds of animals sacrificed, not just the horse. It's this huge event. And then the horse gets washed and adorned with gold and silver and pearls. The wives of the king are the ones who are responsible for adorning the horse. And then they attach it to a chariot, and then they smother it with a blanket. And then the queens get in a circle around the horse. And then supposedly, and if you care, you can ask in the why when we get to the Q&A. I don't think this ever really happened. But supposedly the queen would then lie under a blanket with the horse at a bare minimum with her naked legs entwined around the horse's phallus, and at a maximum actually having intercourse with the horse. And this is why 120 years ago, when British people first started describing this festival, they would say things like, and what comes next is too obscene to be mentioned. And then they would just skip to the next part of the ritual. But I don't really think that actually happened. Now, then the horse gets butchered, the king sits on his throne, and all the power that's been derived through this and the transformations all culminate. There are some more things that happen afterwards, but they're not really relevant to the horse. The horse bears a new reign. It traverses the landscape and inaugurates dominion, just like the horses of Revelation. Unless challenged, it transforms land from one political domain into another. A horse sacrifice can even inaugurate a new world. In the Mahabharata, I don't know, are people familiar with the Indian epics? Some people are nodding their heads. In the Mahabharata, there's this big war between two sets of brothers, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And the Pandavas are the good guys. We know that because they wrote the story afterwards. They won the war, but only at great cost, because the sets of brothers were cousins. And so the war involved killing their own cousins and their friends and former teachers, and it's a great tragedy. By the end of it, nobody's really happy. And the head of the Pandava brothers, Yudhishthira, who's the lead brother, he actually has an Asvamedha sacrifice, not because he's looking to become king, he's already king. He's trying to transform the world from this horrible one into a new next stage where some of the guilt and the misery, at least that he experiences and potentially that everyone experiences, might be abated, to kind of restart the world. So the question that all this, to my mind, because I'm trying to add all kinds of odd but interesting things together into one talk, the question raised is what sacrificial horse might bear apocalyptic AI into the Indian landscape? In the West, Kurzweil and others became bestsellers by the early 2000s. In India, there was kind of a lone prophet crying in the wilderness. D.K. Vadhavan, who I believe he's at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, but I'm not 100% sure of that. He wrote a book about robotics in which he talks about some of Moravec's promises, and he quotes Moravec. He's fully consonant with Moravec and Kurzweil and so forth. But I'm going to stick to just two quick little essays he wrote for a journal called Resonance, which is a scientific education journal in India. Resonance is published by the Indian Academy of Sciences, and it's distributed to colleges and high schools and so forth to educate people on some fundamental scientific concepts, sometimes offering new contributions, but also sometimes just kind of reviewing what people know. And Vadhavan has published a number of essays in Resonance, but only two of them talk about apocalyptic AI promises. One is an essay on smart structures and materials, that is, materials that have computation built into them to be responsive. Say if you built a house that was responsive to the ambient temperature outside and inside to regulate heat. He concludes that essay by saying, our machines, smart structures included, will evolve, gradually undermining the distinction between technology and nature and between the living and the non-living. The hardware and software will produce its own hardware and software as needed and desired. By whom? What will the role of human beings be in such a world? So he's directly borrowing off of Moravec's idea that once the machines get smart enough, they're going to start building, the design and build their own next generation and so forth. And he's asking the question, what happens when that's the case? In the second essay that I want to refer to, it's entirely about future forecasting with robotics and artificial intelligence. He traces some contemporary strategies in robotics, like multi-core processing, Rodney Burke's subsumption architecture, that kind of thing. And then he says that if present trends continue, quote, by the year 2050 or so, intelligent robots would have evolved to such an extent that they would take their own further evolution into their own hands, unquote. So that's just a more direct statement than the one he had made in the previous essay. He then mentions mind uploading, Moravec's mind uploading hypothesis, and he goes on to say, quote, it appears inevitable that aided by human beings, an empire of inorganic life will evolve just as biological or organic life has evolved. We are about to enter a post-biological world, unquote. And then, because he's optimistic, because anyone with a truly apocalyptic mindset is, he goes on to say, and here he's borrowing from Moravec again, quote, intelligent robots will not only bring prosperity for all, but will also have highly salutary effects on the ecology of our planet. Now, when I was in India, at the Indian Institute of Science, which is the premier scientific institution in the country, I interviewed lots and lots of scientists. I interviewed people in academia, industry, in hacker culture, and at IAC, these ideas were exceedingly unpopular. A scientist in nanomaterials said of mind uploading that it, quote, might be popular in industry circles, but I think maybe with the common man and with the profound thinkers, soul probably is immortal, unquote. A neurobiologist referred to speculation about mind uploading as, quote, nonsense, unquote. And when I was there, I was back in India for a festival in 2016, and I was chatting with a materials research scientist who, upon hearing of my prior work on mind uploading and so forth, immediately said, oh, like Ray Kurzweil. And then he asked me, do many of us here believe in that? And I said, no, the vast majority do not. And he laughed heartily and exclaimed, oh, good. Because he finds these ideas so ludicrous. Now, despite this, the ideas have currency among younger people in India. A graduate student at IAC told me, quote, of course, many people are inspired by that. We used to talk a lot about science fiction or science fiction ideas, a lot of futuristic ideas. And we try to build. These kinds of futuristic ideas basically guide you. They motivate you, unquote. Others agreed, either in part or whole, citing Hollywood influences and others. So things are changing, and they're changing not just among scientists perhaps, but they're changing in literature also. While humanoid robots existed in late 19th century, late 20th century, what terrible notes, late 20th century Indian science fiction, nothing approximating mind uploading, virtual worlds, transcendent AI did, despite the regularity of those in Western science fiction for decades at that point. More recent Indian lit investigates promises brought to us by these Iron Horsemen and their science fiction inspiration and allies. There's a collection of stories in a book called Breaking the Bow, which are all inspired by the Ramayana. In the Ramayana, there's this exiled prince, his name is Rama, his wife is Sita. We often call him a demon, but it's not really the right word. This demon king Ravana falls in love with Rama's wife, abducts her, and Rama goes on this big long journey to get her back. And eventually, there's this huge war, he slaughters lots of people, Rama kills Ravana, gets Sita back, but then he's suspicious because she's been in someone else's house for the last year, and he tells her to go jump in a fire, more or less literally. So she jumps in a fire, and she comes out unscathed. And he says, oh, I guess you were faithful to me after all. Okay, you can come home with me. And so then they go back home, but then she's pregnant, and the people are like, what if it's Ravana's baby? What if it's not Rama's? And Rama decides to exile her again, and he just has his brother take her away and be done with her. And at the end of the story, he's wandering through the forest, and he meets her and his twin sons, and he's happy, and he says, oh, you can all come back home with me. And she says, are you kidding me? If I've been pure all my life, may the earth swallow me up. And so the earth swallows her up, and she's gone. And we get this brief moment where maybe Rama feels bad about his choices in life. But so that's the Ramayana in a nutshell. Breaking the Bow, this book has stories that are inspired by it. And in one of them, Ravana really wants Sita to love him. So he has this advanced technology, this advanced computer technology, and he creates this infinite plurality of virtual worlds in which he can act out the story over and over and over again until he can convince her to fall in love with him. Right? And so we see that technology appearing in this story. Another story in the text has an AI leaving Earth to self-replicate in imitation of Sita's exile at the end of the Ramayana. One could presume that if advanced AI, transcendent, godlike AI came into being, Hindu-inspired motivations would produce different outcomes than would other motivations. And that's clear enough in these particular texts. The changes are not limited to literature. They include social movements. There are folks in India who anticipate the arrival of intelligent AI, perhaps with Indian characteristics. I met Archana Prasad while I was in Bangalore. She was, at the time, the Times of India or some newspaper listed her as one of the top 30 people under 30 in Bangalore. She had founded an art collective called Jaga, which she said was in part based on, quote, the model of a temple to the internet god and the coming of sentient internet, unquote. And she said, you know, she believed that it was quite plausible that a kind of internet god would arrive, and that when it arrived, it would start out in Bangalore. She said, I would do that in India, and where in India except Bangalore, the population, the conditions, the craziness of everything, how extremely urgent things are here, like in terms of crises. There's no logic to this, she said while laughing. India is a fertile ground for spirituality of any kind and for religions new and old to take root. And so if there was going to be a temple to the internet, where else would it be, honestly? And if it had to choose a very specific location, why not the center of Bangalore? The initial devotees, all of our techies are here, the possible converts. Other groups like the India Future Society, the Bangalore Futurists, and India Awakens have appeared. These groups have connections to Western transhumanist groups. The India Future Society has prominent Western transhumanists on its board of advisors, including Natasha Vita-Moore, James Hughes, and Aubrey de Grey. India Awakens is linked to the Turing Church and is hosting events already in India. The founder of India Awakens, Nupur Munshi, argues that the transhumanist rejection of death and decay aligns it with the worship of the goddess Durga, the goddess who triumphs over evil. After describing the worship of Durga as an inspiration to conquer evil, she writes, quote, I, a woman myself, bow to the mother that resides in all beings in the form of wisdom, power, and compassion, to bless me with courage and strength as I move on with my colleagues in the Turing Church in our endeavor to bring back all those who have left us for an eternal life together, unquote. This in part because Moravec argued that once the computers got good enough, they could actually simulate whole histories and resurrect dead people at a whim. Ray Kurzweil actually has a whole warehouse of stuff about his father. I had a picture of it when I showed him earlier, that he hopes to resurrect his father with advanced computation. Munshi draws on the traditions and worship of Durga to justify a transhumanist vision of salvation through technology. As more Indians become aware of transhumanist promises and seek to find common ground between those promises and their traditional cultures, we'll see the growth of transhumanism in India, but also its transformation. Vadhavan never became a prophet. His articles were largely ignored, unlike Kurzweil's. That Smart Structures and Materials essay was cited just 12 times, and all of them regarding its technical claims. The Robots of the Future was cited only 6 times, none of them by Indians, and still also about the technical claims. The new religious movements of India reimagine the techno-religions of the West, but they don't give up on their traditional gods. They even reference traditional practices in comparison, like the building of the divine in icons to the building of artificial intelligence. So what horses are to be sacrificed, Indian or Euro-American? Vadhavan seems to have forsaken Indian cultural traditions. We don't hear of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and I doubt this will gain traction. It certainly hasn't so far. There's great Indian science fiction now, but it retains the influence of Hindu mythology. So perhaps something Western might go instead. The neo-libertarian ideals that are common in Western transhumanism, or perhaps something bigger and more ideological. It's intriguing that the founder of India Awakens speaks of conquering evil, which is not something that we hear in reading Kurzweil or Moravec or so forth, even as they talk about solving problems. There's a different viewpoint here. The choice, I think, will depend on who has the final say in producing these visions of cosmic transformation. The visions themselves must evolve. The visions that we have in apocalyptic AI text might suffice in Euro-America, in the West, but not necessarily in India, much less China, Africa, South America, or a host of other cultures. Again, lumping large categories, large cultures and diverse cultures into categories. The motives of machines may vary by cultural context. The idea of one machine culture is frankly implausible, given the variety of human cultures. Of course, we may be all called to make sacrifices. If machines become truly intelligent, perhaps they'll assist us in transcending the selfishness of human tribalism in favor of a rich and welcoming and hopefully diverse new world. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It was very interesting. Okay, so we've got some time for questions. David.
Yeah, that's better, yeah. So I've got obviously a super hazy notion of Indian religious practice and that, but I have the impression that there's a strong reincarnation tradition. So I'd sort of half expect there to be so I could die and be reincarnated as a dog or a crocodile or whatever, right? So that's kind of a fluidity about moving between different bodies, and I kind of half expect there to be some kind of idea about you can move into robot bodies, right, or appropriate. That to be easier to think in India, say, than in a Christian tradition where you just die and you go to heaven. So just wondering if, you know, that connection.
Yeah, so the first time that question came up with someone of an Indic religious tradition was with the Dalai Lama, who did say, this was I think in the 1990s, late 1990s, he did say it was at least theoretically plausible that a computer that was built in such a way that it could house computation or could house consciousness would then have a person's consciousness born into it. Because he believed you couldn't create consciousness. All the consciousness that exists already exists, right? But that perhaps something, he wasn't saying that was actually going to happen, only that it was at least theoretically sort of plausible within his understanding of the Buddhist tradition. In Hinduism, you do have that similar question of people being reincarnated. And to some extent, it's actually interesting to see someone talk about resurrecting the dead, right? As Nupur Munshi does, she talks about resurrecting the dead using computation, which would seemingly fly in the face of the idea that those dead were being reborn. You know, what if they were already in some other body at that time? I can only presume they wouldn't be, right? Otherwise it wouldn't work. But yes, so you have a moment where that might be conflicting, right? This idea that you could resurrect them because they're already out there somewhere. And also simultaneously the idea that, hey, we do move across bodies and perhaps we could. But all this is so nascent in India that nobody's had a chance to really start hashing out arguments about how they think these theological ideas might occur. In part because, you know, as the one person said, the quote, profound thinkers aren't interested in this. Right? So it's at the present, you're mostly dealing with young people who are perhaps becoming profound thinkers and will be wrestling with it in the decades to come, but there hasn't been the equivalent of a book like Mind Children that just explores all of this forward. There hasn't been such a book really in India yet that really articulates an Indian view of what all this might be. So, I mean, it's an interesting question to see how that evolves. I don't have a good answer to it.
Any other questions? There's some stuff over there.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask you about this issue of the worship of Durga and this very interesting statement about conquering evil.
Yeah.
And situating your entire talk in relation to the rise of the Hindutva movement in India. So I'm trying now to entangle theology and politics.
I love that.
Well,
adding politics,
okay.
I think, only makes it more fun.
Yeah, so if you just you know, have any thoughts about thinking through that trajectory.
So for those who aren't familiar, the Hindutva movement is the conservative, theological, political, and cultural right-wing movement in India. The Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which is the current governing party, is the political arm of that movement for the most part. I do not know Ms. Munshi's political leanings, even though I've talked with her online a little bit. I've never thought to ask her where she stands in that. And now I'm going to, because it is an interesting question. Exactly, when you talk about conquering evil, you have to figure out which evil you're trying to conquer. And we don't always agree on what constitutes the evil. My reading on her, because in my conversations with her, she seems to be quite a welcoming human being in terms of her overall approach to culture, would be that she leans left in that political perspective. And that for her, the evils, she does specifically talk about the evils of poverty, for example, right? And the evils of violence. So there's no doubt in my mind that she is concerned with kind of what we all might agree is kind of a better world, right? Where people have enough food to eat, where they have health care, and where we try to get along. And so that probably puts her at odds with much of the Hindutva political stance, which tends more in the direction of taking one cultural perspective and making it the cultural perspective, right? So I would guess that she's not comfortable with the BJP political movement or the Hindu political movement, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to speak for her.
She also
hang on 1 second. Let me get to you with the microphone. I have to say that because we're live, nobody can hear you unless you've got the microphone. Okay.
We're live.
Would you class caste as an evil?
I believe she would, but again, she has put on she's hosted an event or two in collaboration with the Turing Church and at the Ramakrishna Mission in Kolkata. But she writes a blog post now and then, but hasn't kind of articulated a whole big theology that might kind of make sense of all these arguments.
Surely that's one of the greatest evils in India.
Well, I mean, it's an evil we all suffer from. I mean, that's something I challenge my students to think about when we talk about Hinduism. I ask them, do we in the United States have a caste system? And a lot of the students come from less privileged backgrounds, and it's not hard for them to see that if you're born poor in New York City, you're likely to stay poor, and that that the similarities are very strong, even when they're not religiously inflected, that they're still socially and culturally very close.
Okay. Anyone else? Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.